Canada's Indian residential school era. Generations of Indigenous children, traumatized, abused, assimilated. In the years that followed, apologies, healing, reconciliation. But what about the schools that still haven't been recognized?
The church is getting away again. I want to form a class action lawsuit that brings the church, the province, and the federal government and the crown under this class action.
How is the federal government not ultimately responsible?
They knew they're fully responsible. They are fully responsible to rectify this matter and include everybody on a blanket situation and compensate all these people that were left out from that package. Then everything will be okay.
Tonight, APTN Investigates takes a closer look at the survivors still fighting for their stories to be heard.
We will let them know when we are satisfied. It's up to us to tell them that, you know. And to talk about reconciliation, this is part of it. A major component of reconciliation.
Is true reconciliation possible without recognition?
The federal government is arguably responsible for any of the maladies that are brought about upon the Indigenous population in Canada.
This has become something of a daily routine for Abraham Parantu.
I'll be there.
The 74-year-old Anishinaabe elder is putting the federal government on notice.
It's like a slap in the face when I heard that we were not included. It felt very bad to me anyway. Like I said, you know, it's like a slap in the face, and that we were not recognized and we were pushed aside, and even though we went through the same process and even sometimes even worse.
Parantu and his cousin George Monroe have started a letter-writing campaign to policymakers in Ottawa.
Hi, George. Hey, good day.
Good day, good day.
Both men are former students of a day school in the small community of Duck Bay, Manitoba. The Duck Bay Special School, number 2163, is one of more than 680 institutions that have been excluded from the recent Indian day school settlement.
We got that evidence. It's right there, black and white on the papers that they came in there to assimilate. They can't just, you know, walk away and say we were not involved. You know, what kind of people are these?
Namely the priests and nuns assigned to the mission under the authority of the governments.
As with most of the excluded institutions, the federal government argues that they provided no funding and had no hand in the day-to-day operation, shifting the blame onto provincial governments or with Duck Bay, a church organization.
They were sent by the federal government. The federal government paid these nuns and these teachers to come to those communities to assimilate. Same thing what they did with the Indian day schools. Same thing what they did with the residential schools. They did to us. Same thing, no difference. And like I said, sometimes even worse.
The Duck Bay School was operated by the Roman Catholic Church, and the allegations of physical and sexual abuse that took place there are horrific. We spoke with a handful of survivors who all shared similar experiences. Former students like Stanley Parantu.
The things that happened inside that school was too much roughness from the sisters. They used to kick us around, slap us around, but they used to drag us around so we wouldn't get away. Get away where, I don't know. It's just that we have to pull them around.
Perantu is in failing health. He wanted to share his story with us while he still had time. Along with the abuse he suffered, he also recalls being forced to wear a dog leash and collar as a form of punishment.
Yeah, they put a leash on me. They used to make sure I don't run away. And I used to be any place where the sisters would go high up follow, because I was like a dog, I might as well say. The dog.
While the duck-based school may have been run by the church, given that it operated in an indigenous community for decades, it's hard to believe that the federal government didn't have some form of involvement. It has become a common defense in these types of cases, and not the first time they've used it.
For our parents, our grandparents, great-grandparents, indeed for all of the generations which have preceded us, this day testifies to nothing less than the achievement of the impossible.
When that was announced in House of Commons by Phil Fontaine, I knew that it was a mistake because it didn't cover everybody.
The 2008 federal apology was a historic moment for residential school survivors across the country. After years of aggressive litigation, Ottawa finally took responsibility for their role in the forced assimilation of Indigenous children in Canada. But for day school survivors like George Monroe, there would be no truth or reconciliation.
Up to today, there's still residential school survivors that hasn't been compensated. So it was it wasn't a true contract because everybody should have been included.
There was a lot of parts in motion, and it was inevitable, and we all knew that there were going to be institutions that were unintentionally excluded, and we knew there was going to be another category of institutions for which there would be some disagreement as to whether they were included or should be included or not. Hi, Zuza.
Hi.
Did you get that stuff together for me?
Stephen Cooper has spent much of his legal career fighting on behalf of the rights of Indigenous people. He was one of more than 100 lawyers that helped negotiate the $5 billion National Residential School Settlement Agreement back in 2005.
Well, concerns, I don't know if that's the right word. I mean, we knew, it's the nature of a class action that you're going to unintentionally and unavoidably exclude some people. And in this case, by some people, we're really talking about some institutions. And the fact that we're dealing with so many people in such a dynamic environment inevitably meant that this was going to happen. And as you know, one of my colleagues repeatedly mentions during settlement discussions, perfect is the enemy of good. We were not going to get perfection, so we had to get as good as we possibly could. The risk, of course, was to lose the opportunity for anything. So in the circumstances, I think what we achieved in 2005 in a very short period of time was better than good, but certainly didn't meet the standard of perfect.
Cooper is no stranger to the exclusion of survivors from the residential school settlement, or the lengths the federal government is willing to go to deny responsibility. He represented the students of Newfoundland and Labrador in their 10-year battle for recognition.
We got our apology.
The federal government constitutionally and historically was or should have been involved in every institution for which the population was primarily and purposely Indigenous. And it's still an argument that we will make in other institutions, I expect, in the future. The nature of a settlement, though, is it doesn't solve all problems. It doesn't include all people with claims against the same defendant. So that the residential school settlement of 2005 reflected the settlement of a discrete and distinct group of claims. That doesn't mean that others aren't ongoing, and I know that some are, and there will be others that come forward.
Others, like the survivors of Duck Bay. In March of 2019, the federal government announced a proposed settlement to the Indian Day School class action. But the $1.4 billion deal first needed to be approved by the courts. Hundreds of survivors from across the country attended the hearings. George Monroe was one of them.
I felt really bad because I stated right away to the people I know, I talked to the circle I'm in, that it wasn't right. You should have never accepted that until it was complete.
Along with the Duck Bay School, more than 680 other institutions have been excluded from the final day school settlement. Institutions like reform schools, boarding homes, Indian hospitals, and sanatoriums that Indigenous children were still forced to attend, but the federal government has refused to take responsibility for.
That's what they're doing right now with this day school thing. It's provincial, they say. All the funding in this country for residential and day schools came from the federal government. One pool of money they went to the province. He will give you this money, you look after this over there. So it was easier for the federal government to divvy the money up to the provinces and do your own things. But the churches were still involved.
Coming up after the break, a warrior picks up the fight.
I will do whatever it takes to get justice and compensation for the people.
And next steps.
We have a lot of things to apologize for, and before we apologize for them, we have to acknowledge that they happened.
I made it a personal mission that I would never give up on getting survivors justice and compensation for what happened to us in these different institutions. And I will do whatever it takes to get justice and compensation for the people.
Ray Mason has spent decades fighting on behalf of survivors of the residential school era. We caught up with him at the Kent Monkman exhibition in the Winnipeg Art Gallery. Mason helped launch both the residential school and Indian Day School class actions against the federal government.
I'm like an old pit bull, you know. I don't give up. And I had to be that pit bull for the other two agreements, you know. And I never say die. You know, I always have a strong spirit, a strong commitment.
This agreement will bring us one step closer to a lasting and meaningful resolution for survivors and their families of this dark and tragic chapter in Canada's history.
Mason rejects the government's decision to exclude more than 680 institutions from the day school settlement. He says that regardless of who operated the institutions, at the end of the day, it was the federal government who is ultimately responsible.
The government is wrong when you do injustice, you know, and they have a fiduciary obligation to make it right, you know, because they had a fiduciary obligation to look after our safety and well-being in those institutions that they put us in, and they lacked that. They didn't live up to that obligation that they were supposed to do.
But for institutions like the Duck Bay School, proving federal involvement has become a point of contention. Even with the government's so-called push for reconciliation, Ottawa still has a nasty track record of fighting cases like these to the bitter end, something that Mason wants to avoid.
For the provincially owned schools, the publicly owned schools, the privately owned schools, and the church-owned schools, sanatoriums, I would like to hammer out one agreement that would cover every one of those, that would consider each school, a type of school.
It's a bold proposition, one that Mason was hoping the government would accept during the day school settlement negotiations. The decision to leave nearly half of the institutions out of the agreement was done behind closed doors. The settlement is being administered solely by Gowling WLG. The Ottawa-based law firm was essentially given a monopoly over the settlement by the federal government and stands to receive $55 million in legal fees.
Did they make a private deal with the government for 700 schools? And the government accepts it because they're getting off easy. They're paying half or maybe a third of what the total cost should be. So naturally the government saved money. We recognize them, but how can you recognize them when you know, only half?
Gowling wouldn't speak with APTN Investigates on camera, but in an emailed statement they said, "We recognize that there are concerns from certain individuals who are not included in the settlement. Significant research went into determining the final list, which only includes schools that were funded, managed, and controlled by Canada during specific periods. We cannot speak to the ultimate decision not to include any specific schools, as those determinations were made by the government."
To me, it's hard to trust the lawyers, you know, because they're only there to fill their own pockets, you know, to and not to worry too much about the people that been tortured through this process. But if they see something that they could make money on, oh, they'll jump on it right away, no problem.
The reason I wanted you guys to come in is to make sure that we're ready for the intake of Kivela Call claimants. These are people that are, in some cases, new to the system.
Alberta-based lawyer Stephen Cooper wasn't involved in the day school settlement, but that doesn't mean he can't be critical of the process or of the historic treatment survivors like those in Duck Bay have had to go through.
We have a lot of things to apologize for, and before we apologize for them, we have to acknowledge that they happened. That when we came as colonials to this country, primarily from Europe, but also beyond, we took over a society, we crushed it purposely, not accidentally, with intent. The country, and particularly the Indigenous people of this country, are still paying the price. And not only the government, which is the head of society in this regard, but the population of Canada has to realize that we have this bit of history that we have to deal with. And until there are apologies, until there is true reconciliation, that's not going to change. And we are, until that happens, no better than other former colonial powers.
Yeah, because you recognize this guy here.
Yeah.
Keach, yeah.
And with more and more survivors passing away each year, time is of the essence. Along with Ray Mason, both George Monroe and Abraham Perantu have already started reaching out to top officials in Ottawa. They want one deal, one agreement that will cover all of the institutions that are still fighting for recognition.
I would like to work out one blanket agreement, not to go to court for each one of them, because courts are very costly, they're very time-consuming, and the thing is, we're passing on by the thousands each year, and that's not fair.
And for the first time in a long time, excluded survivors like those in Duck Bay can see the light at the end of the tunnel.
So that to me is a positive outcome, because if we had to go to court with it, it would take years and years, and probably everybody would die out or something. Yeah. But this way, at least, I have a chance that we will be recognized once we meet with the federal departments, the top officials, and come to a mutual agreement concerning, as a blanket compensation package for all these schools that were left out.
APTN Investigates requested an interview with Crown Indigenous Relations Minister Carolyn Bennett. She was unavailable to appear on camera for this story. The Canadian Museum for Human Rights is a testament to the enduring triumph of the human spirit. Today, there is no exhibit that honors Indian Day School survivors. It's something that Abraham Parontu and George Monroe hope to one day change.
Mr. Speaker, I stand before you today to offer an apology to former students of Indian residential schools. The government now recognizes that the consequences of the Indian residential schools policy were profoundly negative, and that this policy has had a lasting and damaging impact on Aboriginal culture, heritage, and language.
For now, Parontu and Monroe will continue their battle for recognition. If talks with the federal government fail, they are planning on launching their own class action, not only for the survivors of Duck Bay, but also the other institutions that Canada has so far refused to acknowledge.
You'll never have reconciliation in Canada until you deal with us, you satisfy us, you know. And then we will tell you if it's done, you know. Nobody has that right to say, well, it's over.
This is what happened to me, and somebody has to be responsible for that, and that's why I came forward, and not only for myself but for everybody else that's been mistreated the way I was.
As far as the day school, right to the day I die, I guess, until we get recognition. Because like I say, reconciliation. Nobody will be until that circle is complete. That circle, they're halfway. They went halfway, there's the other half here. It's got to be recognized.